Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome to my Saturday Hodgepodge, my weekly wrap-up of book things, bookish things, booktube things, anything I really want to talk about. Today I wanted to just start off by briefly kind of talking about something, and maybe you can get some input from you in the comments section below. And it has to do with the video I posted on Thursday, which, was about 11 modern books, modern works of literary fiction that I think have a happy ending. I got a lot of really interesting comments on that, and one of the things that seemed to be kind of a trend, is that what I want to say? One of the things that seemed to be kind of a theme, maybe, running through some of the comments is the idea that books with happy endings are perhaps not serious, or are maybe a little bit kind of manufactured and not necessarily, as deep, or maybe they aren't as realistic. And I really find it interesting, just to put this out there, that so many of us seem to think that a book that ends in a happy way is less realistic than a book that ends in a sad way. I find this odd because when you think about 19th century literature, and we just finished Victober, those who participated just finished Victober last month. A lot of 19th century Victorian literature ends as kind of a happy story. And so it seems to be, at least in the English-speaking world, there was that people favored the happy ending, at least during the 19th century. And then in the 20th century, that seems to have shifted, where, what we favor are the less happy endings, or the sad endings, or maybe just ambiguous endings. And I find it really interesting, kind of historically, socially, etc. In that, it's not that people in the 19th century's lives were happier. It's not that things worked out for everybody, or the majority of people in the 19th century any more than they do now. But, there definitely is, I think, a certain amount of 20th century, 21st century pessimism that's worked its way into culture and into the arts, suggesting that, our kind of preset, or our default position, is unhappiness. And therefore, our literature should reflect, that as reality. And so I find it interesting, and I guess what I'm getting at is why we have that perception. Is it your position that that's just more realistic, or do you think there's just some kind of cultural pessimism seeping in, as I've mentioned here? One of the most interesting comments I got suggested, that life is kind of a wave form, and we have peaks and valleys, happiness, unhappiness, and that where a book ends determines what kind of book it is. Does it end on a peak, or a rising thing where things are getting better, or there is happiness, or does it end on a downer? That it just depends on where the book ends, whether it's a happy or sad book. And I think that's really true, and a really kind of wise, and I thought good way of looking at it. But if that's true, if the books are following that kind of wave idea, that kind of cyclical idea, cycling people, characters, cycling between happiness and sadness and somewhere in between, then to me that is an argument for the idea that happy books are as realistic as sad books. Anyway, I'm not exactly sure. As usual, I start with these things, I start rambling. I'm not exactly sure where I'm going, but if you have thoughts about this that go beyond what you might have left on the other video, or something else you want to share, or something with me you want to argue with, please leave that in the comments down below. I really look forward to that discussion. I did finish 2 books this week, one of which I had started last week, and that was River of the Gods by Candace Millard. This is one of my nonfiction November reads. Candace Millard is one of my favorite kind of popular narrative historians. She's written several books that I like, one about Teddy Roosevelt. Probably my least favorite is one about Winston Churchill. There's one about President Garfield. And this one is primarily about Sir Richard Francis Burton and his expedition and its aftermath, searching for the source of the White Nile. This book, as I think I mentioned last week, the pacing, Millard's probably greatest gift is for pacing and for understanding which details to include and which not. Very skilled historian in creating a perception of the figures in her works, and giving us kind of insights into to tell us things about their characters and what to include and what not to include. It's really great. I just think in this case, I don't think her story was for me as interesting as it might ordinarily be, or as it might have been at some other time. There is dramatic tension, there are characters in conflict, there are all those kinds of things, but to me, it just wasn't quite as good as like The River of Doubt, the book, or excellent book, about Teddy Roosevelt's exploration in the Amazon, which almost killed him. Or as I thought, moving and kind of in a microcosmic way, focused on the assassination of President Garfield. I just thought that was an excellent book too. To me, this one's good, and it's a good work of history, a good work of popular history. I just didn't find it as interesting as I thought that I would. The second book I read, started and finished this week, is The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. This is already really kind of a classic, I think, of American socio-racial history. The book is about, 12, 13 years old at this point, and it essentially explains in detail, it makes the argument that the war on drugs led to mass incarceration, and that mass incarceration focuses primarily on black people, and particularly black men, and that has created a new kind of Jim Crow. And I've kind of talked about this a little bit before, even before I read the book, that if we think about the major institutions created by white Americans to control the black population, they all have to do with some form of control. Slavery is replaced by Jim Crow, and what Alexander here is arguing is that the war on drugs and mass incarceration are the replacement for the new Jim Crow. And it's not a historical accident that our obsession with law and order politics and the war on drugs coincided with a desire by the Republican Party to win over the votes of white Southerners as the Democratic Party embraced civil rights for African Americans to a greater and greater extent. It might seem like then that McGhee is essentially attacking the right, attacking Republicans here. She isn't. As a matter of fact, I think the most damning things she has to say are about Bill Clinton, which I think are absolutely fair. She is not, doesn't pull her punches about Barack Obama. I think she makes a really compelling argument that the war on drugs has actually created a new system in which African American men find themselves with very limited options and very limited choices. And I won't go into all the details and all the ways she does that in the book, but I will say, if you're ever in a bookstore and you just kind of want to know what her argument is, there is actually a section in which she explains how the new Jim Crow system works, which in my edition begins on, begins on page 230 and goes to page 232, and it's called How It Works. And in How It Works, she kind of condenses, summarizes just a basic outline of everything she said in the preceding 230 pages, so that when you read it in that summary form, you're like, yes, I remember you talking about this and exactly how it all works. To give you some idea, it goes beyond just the time in which people spend in jail, predominantly black men spend in jail, but also all the rights they lose, all the restrictions put on their lives when they come out of jail. I think it begs at very least, a question about when does punishment end? When do we start punishing people who have broken the law and gone to prison? We used to say they've served their debt to society, which she effectively points out here is that these black men who go to prison and then come out are never really free from that. And again, I won't go into all the details, but it just really is a brilliant book. A lot of things that I thought I knew and had learned actually are kind of, this might be the source for that. Having said that, you should know, this is kind of an interesting thing I think about history too, and I think about this book in relationship to Wilkinson's book, Caste, because they're kind of in a similar vein. That what Michelle Alexander's book does is she looks at all these actual, surveys and all these studies and all these papers and all the writings of all these other academics, and she puts it into a less academic form. And then Isabel Wilkerson took this and other sources in Caste and put it into an even probably more accessible narrative form. But one of the things I learned about then in this is that punishment and that restriction of opportunities that comes from conviction, a felony conviction, and here she argues primarily for felony convictions of the war on drugs, never really goes away. That thanks to a lot of things that happened during the Clinton administration, that people who are convicted felons lose their right to federal housing, they lose their right to vote, they can lose their right to hold licenses, which limits their job anyway. So it's just a really compelling and good book, and I would highly suggest that this is a topic that interests you, that you read it. And then I started, right off the heels of that, I started The Sum of Us by Heather McGhee. The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. Read the introduction this morning, and really looking forward to getting into that, even though I have to tell you, my paperback, the print is tiny, and the paper is not pure white, and that makes it really hard on an old man's eyes, and I kind of wish maybe I'd gotten a Kindle edition of that. Let's see. Oh, the other thing, and I've been forgetting to point this out this month, is that I am participating in the World Cup read-along, which is sponsored by Mark at Book Time with Elvis. Sorry, a car's going by the front of my house really slow. Which is sponsored by Mark at Book Time with Elvis, in which essentially you are assigned a country in the World Cup, and for each round you read a book from that country. So my country is Poland. I think I'm going to read The Soccer War by Ryszard Kapuscinski, a Polish kind of travel writer, journalist. If I can find a copy, The Soccer War seems really appropriate considering we're talking about the Soccer World Cup, and I'm looking forward to that. And so I want to make sure I shout out Mark for putting that event on. Book Time with Elvis. Mark at Book Time with Elvis, a great channel. He also sponsors usually an African Cup tournament the same way, which is a great way, and I miss it every year, which is a great way to start reading more literature written from Africa. So please go check out Mark's channel. Leave a link to his channel down below. Let's see, I think that's it. I can't think of anything else I wanted to talk about other than point out that I'm wearing my second Astros World Series shirt. This is the one, you know, from the no-hitter that the Astros threw against the Phillies. Anyway, I look forward to your comments in the comment section below, and as always, thank you for watching.